Hey everybody, welcome to Equality Florida's IG Live. I'm Nadine Smith, and I'm so glad you're joining us today. I'm gonna give a few moments for folks to join in, and if you do, please do drop a hello in the comments. Let me know you're out there. And hi Samantha, Roman, Word Bobby, I see you. And please be sure to share an invitation with your circle as well. And we really have a great show. This is part of our honoring of LGBTQ history. And we are going to be talking about the history in Florida, because as goes Florida, so goes the nation. And one of the darkest chapters in our movement unfolded right here in the state of Florida. And we're going to have the absolute best person to talk about that joining us. So I see that more and more people are pouring in, so I'm going to just give you a few more moments, and then I'm going to invite our guest. All right. Casey and Jules, thanks for joining. And celebrating LGBTQ history, and today in honor of LGBTQ History Month, we're diving into a really powerful chapter and a dark chapter, hey Robert, of American history, and one that was buried for decades, and we want to talk about why it matters. And so joining me today is author Robert Fieseler. He is a journalist, and he's the author of American Scare, and it is a new book. I have been evangelical about telling people how important it is to read this book, because it really unearths, even if you've heard of the Johns Committee, you haven't heard the full story of the Johns Committee. And right now is the moment that we must understand what the Johns Committee is and how what is happening now has direct lineage to what unfolded then. So Robert, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to see you again.
Great to see you too, Nadine. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so we've got the feed is filling up, and I guess for those who haven't yet read American Scare, what inspired you, to write this book? And for people who've never heard of the Johns Committee, what is the quick summary of
Yeah.
who the Johns Committee is?
So the opening quote to American Scare is a quote by the Pulitzer Prize-winning poet Louise Gluck, and it's whatever returns from oblivion returns to find a voice. So that's the quote. Whatever returns from oblivion returns to find a voice. So in the South, which I'm not originally from actually, it feels like the stories are just dropping from the trees. This is a storytelling society. But I have found there's been a certain subset of stories that have been suppressed, quashed, buried, and oftentimes those are queer and civil rights stories. And in the land where the past has not even passed, those stories do not disappear. They return with a vengeance, actually. And those voices demand to be re-woven back into the tapestry of the communities and lands that they loved. And so my work is about that return, always. Capital R, return. It's emotional, beautiful, menacing, controversial, but always compelling and also always essential, I find, to our national experiment in self-governance. So my first book was about, Tinderbox was about a buried story in New Orleans about a largely forgotten, notoriously unsolved arson fire that took place at a gay bar in 1973. New Orleans claimed 32 lives. It was a deadliest fire on record in New Orleans history, but it was suppressed in its day. Work was about returning that. For American Scare, this story involving what we're going to discuss here tonight, it's the American Scare is about a return as well. It's about the return I'm studying here in terms of where the place where historical inquiry meets memory, the past rushing towards us and us looking back at the past and considering it. It's about a largely forgotten McCarthy-era purge that for 9 years, from 1956 to 1965, held residents of the state of Florida ransom to an extrajudicial committee that had the anyone it didn't like, black integrationists, closeted queer professors, charismatic state employees, to be communists and perverts and enemies of the people, and subversives. Those were the words they used in this era of the Southern McCarthyism, which a lot of people aren't familiar with. So it was called formerly the Florida Legislative Investigation Committee, and it was run by this strident segregationist senator named Charlie Johns. And what he perpetrated in his day became so notorious among Floridians that they nicknamed it the Johns Committee. And those of that era who say the word Johns Committee, you can hear the chill in their voices. And so it's a true story of American tyranny that planted the toxic seeds of Tallahassee's strongman culture, both anti-black and anti-queer dimensions, so deeply it continues to cyclically impact our nation today. And yet most people don't know about it because the story was suppressed, buried, sealed, censored for years. And so American Scare aims to return this story back to the body politic, back to the historic record, and back to Floridians who deserve to know sort of where they come from in their society. What are the origins of some of the more toxic aspects of Tallahassee politics? And you asked me where I learned about it. I learned about it, there was an exhibit called Queer Miami at the History Miami Museum. And a good friend of mine, a scholar named Julio Capó, Dr. Julio Capó, curated the exhibition. And in that exhibition, there were two video screens. One was of Dr. Stacy Brockman, who was an academic scholar who's basically devoted a large part of their career to the study of the Johns Committee and wrote the definitive academic text, Communists and Perverts Under the Palms. And when I went to go see the History Miami exhibit in 2019, I hadn't heard of the Johns Committee. And I walked into this exhibition. Keep in mind that I'm obsessed with historic returns. And as I walk into this exhibition, Stacy Brockman says, as if on cue in the video screen, I don't think anyone knows much about anything about the Johns Committee anymore. And I was just hooked. Soul level hooked, where I thought, this is the greatest academic scholar admitting a lack of ignorance on the part of her own Southern society and expressing frustration in a way that I found intensely compelling. And I thought, there's something to this, where there's a reason, there's almost a sort of, wherever you can tell there's sort of friction or resistance to knowledge, you can tell there must be something deeper behind it. And I sensed if I chased the Johns Committee story, I was going to find a very, very deep well, a very intense political legacy that was going to relate to a lot of the disorientation that we're feeling now with the nastiness of our political system and the crisis in our body politic.
Well, I think there's two things I want to point out. I was born in 1965, so I was born as the Johns Committee was coming to an end. But for years, my state legislator, the person who represented me in Tallahassee, was the youngest member of that committee. Whoa. So in terms of how close we are to that politic that was unfolding in our state, I think it's just important for people to realize people injured, and there were lots of people injured. They had their careers destroyed.
Thousands.
There were lives that were taken, harassed to the point of suicide. All of these things were unfolding in a timeline where there are people alive now who experienced it firsthand. That's part one. But the other thing, and I think this is so important, as an organization, Equality Florida, we understand that you can't do justice work on LGBTQ issues without addressing racism. And the real origin story of the Johns Committee resonates particularly right now as you see Donald Trump, for example, weaponizing the Justice Department to go after Letitia James. And you told the story about one of the goals as Northerners, pro-integrationist Northerners began to move to Florida. I want you to set the stage, because there was an image that they wanted on the cover of the New York Times as sort of the emblem of how they would put a stop to these messages of integration and shifting of
Yeah.
political power. But talk about that.
So, yeah, Florida, up to World War II, was not actually considered a very, believe it or not, relevant state. It was actually had about the same number of electoral votes as Mississippi, right? This was not yet, it experienced a boom post World War II that's even difficult to comprehend from our current standpoint. You have to think about Miami just explodes and they call it the Magic City, kind of out of nothing. It had had a small boom in 20s, but it was really post World War II where it surges into relevance as really the youngest metropolis of the country. Tampa and St. Pete are suddenly called the Sun Coast by realtors. Orlando, which had not been much of nothing, suddenly booms into relevance in its own right. And culturally, everyone wants a taste of the frozen concentrated orange juice. Everyone wants a beach vacation. Jim Morrison somewhere in Clearwater, humping one or several people. Jack Kerouac's in Orlando writing. Elizabeth, it's culturally significant. Elizabeth Bishop, the poet, is writing some really important poems in Key West. Rockets are flying off Cape Canaveral. And in the midst of all that crazy growth, which people call the New Florida, on top of it was one of the most old school hacks on top of the peninsula, old school post-Reconstructionist, racist Southern governmental structures that was determined to hold on to all power of the state while benefiting from the tax revenue of the New Florida. And this group of old Florida Dixiecrat Democrats, because it was the Democratic Party that shut down Reconstruction, actually. It was Southern racist Democrats that shut down Reconstruction in the 1800s, then held on to power in a way where they had constitutions that enshrined segregation into the very language of the founding documents. That was all part of the North Florida system, from like Pensacola all the way over to Jacksonville, basically in a line. And they called themselves the Pork Chopper Democrats. And they were determined to hold on to segregation by any means necessary, and also to prevent any redistricting that would account for a vote by population, because they didn't want to get outvoted at all by the massive boom state of the peninsula at all. And so basically what happened was the pork choppers could get elected to districts that had only like 20,000 people in it, would get you to a state Senate seat, whereas Miami needed 500,000 votes to elect the same person to that same office. So it was crazy. And so basically the pork choppers decided and that basically they took a blood oath, like a Klan-style blood oath, at one of these old-school rural initiation ceremonies. This wasn't even like it's not symbolic. They promised each other that they would hold fast to this blockade to prevent representation for the south of Florida, which was pro-integrationist, and they were gonna, and basically they panicked even more in 1954 when the U.S. Supreme Court handed down the Brown v. Board of Education decision, which said that separate but equal in education, segregation in education, or Florida called it the dual school system, said it was unconstitutional. And so the Johns Committees founded in the midst of basically pro-integration organizing that begins to happen throughout the state, and then it coalesces at the seat of power, where it always is in Florida, Tallahassee. Not saying it's fair. I'm just saying that's where it is, technically, officially. And in Tallahassee specifically, in 1956, Florida experienced their own version of the Montgomery boycott, called the Tallahassee bus boycott, where major leaders, NAACP and other organizations, said, we're going to organize a boycott of public transportation in this black majority city, such that to end segregation and public busing. And the Johns Committees founded in 56 with the specific purpose to stop, they called it racial fear-mongering, to stop the racial integrators, and also to stop the Tallahassee bus boycott. So they were going after the bus boycott. They were also going after, down in Miami, school integrationists, specifically the head of the NAACP Miami, Father Theodore Gibson, who was leading a case to integrate Miami schools so that his very bright son, Theodore Jr., could attend the highest quality public school in Miami, regardless of his race. He was a black child that deserved to. His father fell to the best school in Miami, so his father was suing on his behalf to integrate Miami schools. So the Johns Committee dreamed of shutting down the Miami bus boycott, and then also jailing and arresting, right, the chief plaintiff of Miami school integration, Father Theodore Gibson, the head of the Miami NAACP, because their dream was, here you asked about what their dream was, the image. They wanted to get Theodore Gibson in prison stripes, right, on a Florida road sign in a chain gang, and then they wanted to photograph it as a warning of what would happen to any uppity, that was the word they used, it's rude, but to any uppity individual that decided to challenge the racial order. And this is the sort of the Johns Committee, a little bit of their racist origins and ethos. They wanted to maintain and hold on to one more year, one more month, one more day of segregated power by any means necessary, and they viewed integration as an existential threat.
Can you hear me okay? Nadine, I'm going to hop off. I'm having trouble hearing, and I'm going to hop back on, okay?
Oh, yeah, actually, did that just get better?
That did. That fixed it.
Okay. Well, I was just saying that it's wonderful. I mean, I think what's important for people to understand in this moment is that redistricting in order to preserve power for a small minority has always been part of the DNA of the state of Florida. What you're
Right.
describing, all these people are moving to South Florida, and they absolutely are being gerrymandered in a way to reduce their ability to elect representation.
Mm.
And what I really also want to talk about is it's not just about votes, it's about the corruption, the kind of corruption that we see right now in Florida, where we have a governor who's embroiled in a $10 million scandal around his foundation,
Mm.
has just, handed over land in a sweetheart deal to one of his cronies, for like 83 million. And that's before we get to the so-called alligator detention center on sensitive Everglade land that went to no bid contracts, rushed out the door, that again delivered hundreds of millions of dollars to his political buddies. So wherever we see this kind of appeals to racism, attacks on the LGBTQ community, we always see attempts to gerrymander people out of power, and we see the kind of corruption that comes when they consolidate power. And in Florida,
Yes.
the Republican Party controls the governor's mansion, the House, the Senate, every cabinet position, and they actually have a veto-proof majority in the legislature. So
Wow.
it's a total recipe for it is just such a recipe for corruption. And so that's why when I say, when we look back on how the Johns Committee formed, the kind of rhetoric they were using, the racism that ignited it, and then the anti-gay bigotry that turned that match into a bonfire,
Yeah.
is something that we have to learn from. But let's talk about that moment,
Maybe you were
because
right though about it all being about money. So, because
yeah,
segregation, people forget, represented basically the most radical form of white affirmative action in terms of a guaranteed white financial privilege, where you could be a white man intensely connected who was of moderate talent to mediocre talent, who expected riches from your society. Charlie, and they didn't even call it corruption then in Florida in the 50s and 60s. They didn't even call it spoils. They just called it helping out your friends or the practices of good government. So Charlie Johns of the Johns Committee also sat on the Senate Appropriations Committee, where he approved, right? Basically, he approved appropriations to himself because he also ran an insurance company called the Charlie Johns Insurance Corporation that, I wish this wasn't true, that issued the insurance policies for the prisoners that were held at Rayford State Prison in Stark, Florida, in his senatorial district. And this was all considered okay. So oftentimes...
And didn't he have like the ICE contract at University of Florida?
He did. He sold ice in Florida, pre-air conditioning. That's like selling heating oil in Alaska. But he sold ice in Florida, and he had a handshake deal to sell all the ice at the University of Florida football games, which were, guess what, all white and segregated people. It blows people's mind. There wasn't that. Basically, it was white people playing football, but like that, and that was it. But that was, and he basically, and that was, he also, in order to facilitate that, he could shake down the University of Florida president to basically park his car at the presidential home for an easier walk to the Florida field in the midst of when he was selling ice. So I mean, so this is a person that whenever you see campaign platforms or scare tactics put forward, where an individual is saying, fear this group, fear the other, look over here, I'm going to wave heads on spikes and show you a social danger, you can trust that that politician, that arch-conservative politician that's exhibiting totalitarian tendencies, that person is finding a way to underhandedly benefit financially from that same system.
So let's talk about how it went from a racist campaign to drive out civil rights advocates, pro-integrationists, anybody, and then they really kind of fumbled the ball. They ended up going up against brains that were mightier than theirs, but they had built this powerful structure that had just really, it's hard for people to understand how much power the Johns Committee really wielded. It wasn't just like a committee that heard testimony as we mostly think about. This was an investigatory body that could, you could be guilty of perjury if you didn't tell the truth. They threatened people, with jail time. And I mean, so it's hard for people, I think, now when you say the Johns Committee, when we think of committees in Tallahassee, it really is hard to understand just how significant and unprecedented this was.
Yeah. I mean,
but despite that, they still fumbled and had to regroup and find kind of a new target. But talk about that part.
Okay, so Charlie, you're right about the amount of power he had. So Charlie Johns was a former acting governor who had, prior to even the Johns Committee, stage managed the inheritance of the governorship from a sick man, which was, I mean, say what you will. This was a man who brutally twisted corrupt rules to his own advantage. Then he lost the governorship because Charlie Johns never basically won a free and fair election his entire career. All he did was play with boundaries and choose his own voter. And when he couldn't choose his own voter, when he was running for governor, he lost very badly in a way he embarrassed himself. So then he created this committee that was ostensibly a legislative committee, but it absorbed powers of the executive branch from state law enforcement, where they could commission state law enforcement and annex them and put them to work, state highway patrol, sheriffs, etc. And also it took on judiciary responsibilities, where the Johns Committee could hold people in contempt. And when you're in contempt of the Johns Committee, that is a criminal charge that then enters the court system, and then you're at risk of jail time because they didn't like you that day when they called you to testify, or when they pulled you out of your life and took you to a random isolated spot to interrogate you for hours without a lawyer. And so basically the Johns Committee, their reign of terror against the NAACP was started in 1956, goes through 1958, and then the NAACP national gets sick of this, and they decide they're going to send their appellate lawyers from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And the NAACP Legal Defense Fund lawyers had argued the Brown v. Board of Education decision. These were some of the best appellate lawyers of the 20th century, maybe ever. and they sent Robert L. Carter, a guy who co-argued with the future Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall to defend Theodore Gibson and other people being harassed by the Johns Committee in open hearings, and also threatened. They were basically threatened with contempt of the Johns Committee because they wouldn't give up the membership rolls for the NAACP in Florida, because they didn't want every person who'd ever sympathized with integration to basically be on threat of jail time. And so what happened was the NAACP hamstrings and gums up in court all the Johns Committee's efforts. And then the Johns Committee is stuck in 1958. They freak out. They've got this appropriation. They've promised heads on spikes. They said that this was all about communism. They've yet to produce a single communist. And so they know they're an investigation committee with nothing to investigate. And so they need a new enemy. So they decide, wasn't there a professor at the University of Florida who in the federal McCarthy era Red Scare trials, didn't this guy named John Reynolds testify up there? And didn't he refuse to answer something? And wasn't he fired from the University of Florida as a result? Yes, we're going to go to Gainesville in 1958, and we're going to stake out John Reynolds' home, and we're going to find all his communist collaborators. So that's what they do. They go to this basically the private home of this proverbial commie that got away, and they basically hide in the bushes, ridiculously, observing this private citizen who doesn't even work for the state government anymore, and is not a state employee anymore. And what they don't find any communists, but what they do find is artistic professors going to and from John Reynolds' house. And John Reynolds also participates in this thing called the Gainesville Theater Company, the Gainesville Little Theater. So they go to the they start following this professor around, and then they follow this professor. They don't find communists at the Gainesville Little Theater, but they do find some attractive bachelors who seem to be hugging each other a lot. And then afterwards, they follow some of these men, and they find, oh, these men seem to be congregating at remote places in the woods. Or they seem to be gathering in, oh my gosh, the basement bathroom of the Alachua County Courthouse. And they go into this bathroom, and they find gay paraphernalia everywhere, stuff out of the gay Kama Sutra that these Johns Committee prudes had never believed it. So they stumble upon cruising centers, right, in a place where homosexuality is still developing a very nascent identity for most people. This is still an activity they perform or a release they receive. Very few people it's illegal to self-identify as gay, and so they live very careful, discreet lives outside of these moments where they meet each other in these in these cruising zones where all bets are off. They let loose. My gosh. And so the Johns Committee can't believe it. They schedule an emergency meeting at the Alachua County Courthouse above said bathroom, which was basically the basement bathroom of that courthouse. Had been like the gay Times Square of Gainesville. And so they decide we're gonna hold this meeting. And it's gonna have the Board of Control, the Board of Education, so like higher ups from several state senators. The sheriff of Alachua County, they tour that bathroom, and they decide the homosexual threat is so grave, we're going to need to make this our major focus. And then they realize they're going to need to sort of around the elbow to get to the backside. They're going to need some back-ended rationale to explain to people, the public, how they just went from the NAACP to closeted men masturbating each other basically in a basement bathroom in Gainesville. How are they going to do? And then they realized that public sentiment against gay folk was so intense at that point, especially public. We're not talking about discreet stuff or Southerners out of the gay Lindsey Graham style. Sorry to reference that, but I'm just going to do it. We're talking about discreet Southerners that were performing these activities. They decided the public's going to not care why we're researching these people. They're only going to care that we go after these individuals because we're going to utilize a theorem called homosexual recruitment theorem to scare the public and say these gay individuals or these closeted homosexual individuals are corrupting our college students, corrupting the future of the state of Florida. They're trying to bring down the American family. That's a Marxist goal. There you go. And so that's how they got from basically an organization built to bring down racial integration to suddenly targeting any and all person suspected of homosexuality throughout the state who basically was tied to a state paycheck. that then they could just rifle through these individuals' lives. And these individuals lived precarious lives. A lot of them were in denial. Many of them were married. They didn't understand, in some cases, what they were doing. Several of the professors at University of Florida were worldly enough that they'd gone and they'd seen other gay communities elsewhere. But otherwise, many Southerners considered this a kind of like discreet horseplay or things like that. So for the first time in their lives, these individuals are going to be targeted by the state, called something, said that their behavior was tied to an identity to them, and threatened to say, if you don't confess and name everyone else you know who does this, we are going to call you before a public hearing, and we're going to make you say all of this in public in front of news cameras, and we're going to ruin the reputations of your family, your wives and children, anyone who's ever known you. And so basically, and oftentimes this drove many of the victims of the Johns Committee purges to become suicidal and to threaten suicide. In addition to just, it was beyond the addition of the idea of losing your job. It was the idea of losing not just your place, but your family's place in Southern society. Is what the Johns Committee played on and threatened, because they knew that they could gain a lot of political points off of it, and they certainly did.
And to be clear, at this point in Florida law, to be gay was criminalized.
Yes.
There were felony lewd and lascivious laws.
Yeah, crime against nature laws.
Yeah,
yep.
all of that. And so they were really playing on the fear of imprisonment and public humiliation. And
Yep.
so I want to jump to the place where someone who you interviewed, who sort of became a linchpin in the investigation, became, and in a weird way, had already been through the same thing in the military.
Yeah. Art Copleston, who was one of the last living survivors of the University of Florida Gainesville Johns Committee purges. He's a 93-year-old gay guy living in one of the only two places in the world that a 93-year-old gay guy lives. One's Wilton Manors, Florida. Guess where the other one is? Palm Springs, California. He lives in Palm Springs. So Art Copleston, as a sophomore at the University of Florida, was targeted by the Johns Committee on suspicion of his homosexual activity, which he was participating in. He had a boyfriend who was a married University of Florida engineering professor named Tim Reed, and additionally, Art Copleston was part of a kind of gay social underground. He was a young person in his 20s getting to know himself. And so that he had mentor professors who were gay and worldly too, that he would like to go, listen to the Metropolitan Opera on Saturday afternoons with. This is stuff gay guys would do together in the 50s. And someone gave up his name to the Johns Committee, which were now spread very active throughout Gainesville. And so what they did was they targeted Art Copleston in a way that they knew would make him panic the most, because they thought that a panicked student would be most likely to confess and also give up names that would continue on their investigation. So they pulled Art Copleston out of and arrested Art Copleston out of a final exam for his accounting class. And they publicly agents came in, stormed into a classroom, shouted his name. He complied, fearful that they would call him a queer publicly and force him to, no matter what happens, transfer schools, because the stigma of that would have meant that he basically couldn't attend college anymore in Florida in the time period. They interrogated him at a soundproof room of a basement room of the campus police station for several hours, during which time he was denied a lawyer. He was given neither food nor water, denied access to a bathroom. And Art Copleston, at one point, to pressure him to confess to his gay activities, they said they produced a correct phone number for his parents who were recovering alcoholics, and he was their only child. And they said, what would happen if we called your parents and told them what a disgusting son they had? And he nearly broke in that moment, because he basically, as the only child of alcoholic parents, he had that relationship where basically the roles between child and parent had reversed, and he'd done a lot of raising them throughout his adolescence. He had a very difficult life. and that he nearly broke, but then a reason he didn't break was one aspect of that difficult life was he'd had to financially provide for himself after high school. He'd enrolled in the Air Force, and he'd served in the Air Force at Tyndall Air Force Base in Panama City in Florida, where he had been used as a member of the Office of Special Investigations, OSI, the military unit that investigated on base and around it homosexual activity. And Art Copleston had actually been in a closeted status, used as a decoy in sting operations, where basically he'd been lured, he'd been used and lured. Among other homosexuals, to catch people. So Art Copleston, from his military experience, understood that homosexual investigations, 99% of them depend on a confession, because it's very rare that you catch people actually in the act. And so he knew in that moment, his military training clicked into place in that moment with the Johns Committee in Gainesville, in the basement room of Campus Police Station. The windows are blacked out with paint. There's like this single swinging bulb over a table, and the phone number of his alcoholic parents are presented in front of him, and he realizes, I'm not going to say anything. And so he sticks to his guns and doesn't say anything. And what happens is they're so mad at him for not confessing, they stalk him for the next 3 years of his college experience, to the point where they're following him to and from classes. They're observing and surveilling him as he's reading textbooks at the library, and they invade his last 10 feet of private space by standing outside of his dorm room door with sound equipment, listening in at times when he's just sitting there silently. Basically, they ruin his entire undergraduate experience as a 20-something college kid. Who were you? And like, I'm trying to think who I was as an undergrad. Undergrad is supposed to be about fun. Like, and what happens to him is he is directly the target of a state inquisition. They become obsessed with him, to the point where when he graduates in 1961, he packs up his car and flees the state of Florida and crosses state lines, swearing to never come back again. Now, eventually, Art Copleston, it takes him decades, but at the end of his life, in his 80s, he gains the strength and the insight to remember and publicly recount for the first time the things that happened to him that might have to do with stuff that he continues to deal with for the rest of his life. Post-traumatic stress disorder, body trauma, body shaming, internalized homophobia, all these things. And Art Copleston in his 80s gains the strength to finally testify, and now he is the most prominent survivor of the Johns Committee purges, and he's the bravest person I know, who will detail exactly what happened to him, and how what happened to him when he was in his early 20s, right, in 1959, 1960 Florida, continues to impact him now in 2025, right, in his life as a 90-year-old in California. That's how deeply the events that the Johns Committee, the stuff they did to him, damaged him and haunted him. And he talks about this because he says, what happened to me isn't just my experience. This is representative of what happened to thousands of lives ruined, hobbled, maimed.
And for everyone listening, this was done by the government of Florida with taxpayer dollars. They destroyed these lives in an atmosphere where discrimination was legal. And, I think I mentioned to you before, I had a friend who went to the University of Miami. She had fallen in love for the first time. She and her girlfriend were feeling that sort of invincibility that first love can bring.
Yeah.
She came from a prominent family in Connecticut, and she got caught up in the Johns Committee. Her girlfriend confessed she did what Art did and denied everything. And you just think about what that does to you. But one of the things she said was they brought a newspaper from her hometown into the interrogation room and told her if she didn't give up names, that the headline would be "Pervert Expelled from University of Miami," and that it would devastate her family. And she was required, after denying, to have a notebook that she was to keep notes of a diary of her dates with men, that she was to surrender to investigators at any time they asked for her. And so again, you just go, these are young people in their 20s living in that kind of pressure. And so when we talk about the importance of rainbow crosswalks, when we talk about the importance of these visible markers, they are not just decoration. We are talking about the state and local government acknowledging these horrific things they did to our community, acknowledging the resilience of our community to survive those kinds of experiences, because it certainly didn't end in 1965. The
Right.
Johns Committee ended, but this fight did not end. And finally, the rainbow crosswalks, the rainbow flags, the pride proclamations are there to say we acknowledge that history, and this is our promise as the government that inflicted this pain, that it will not happen again.
Yeah.
So as we see them literally ripping up the rainbow crosswalks and going after the books in the library, we hear the echoes of this time period, which was the precursor to Anita Bryant, which is the precursor to DeSantis. And it is always scapegoating, it is always racist, it is always sexist, it is always homophobic. And now we see them targeting the transgender community with this level of hate for the same reason that you identified earlier. It doesn't have to be logical, it didn't have to make sense, but they could tap into people's ignorance and coin that into fear.
Mm-hmm.
But I want you to tell the story before we go about the downfall of the Johns Committee, because to me there's a lesson in how we got there, but there's also a lesson in how and what eventually broke them.
Yeah. So Red Scares are brought down when a few decent individuals stand up bravely, and then eventually others join them. But it takes a few individuals actually standing up to basically a tidal wave. So what happened, and in Florida's case, the two major individuals were Black citizens. One was aforementioned, the guy I mentioned, Father Theodore Gibson, the president of the Miami NAACP, who was suing to integrate Miami schools. He became targeted by the Johns Committee and threatened with jail time because he refused to give up the membership roles of the NAACP. They basically harassed and hounded him to the steps of the U.S. Supreme Court, where and it ended up being a U.S. Supreme Court case in 1962 to 63 called Gibson versus Florida Legislative Investigation Committee, where Robert L. Carter, the great NAACP attorney, represented Gibson, and the state of Florida neglected in their arrogance to send their attorney general. Instead, they sent the chief lawyer for the Johns Committee, a guy named Mark L. Hawes, a veritable ambulance chaser. They sent him to the Supreme Court, where he embarrassed the state of Florida, wasted the first precious seconds of his oral arguments before the Supreme Court, complaining of a cold, then telling a joke that nobody laughed at, and in the notes, the clerk of the court wrote "attempt to laughter" in brackets. It's really brutal, and Father Theodore Gibson emerged victorious, arguing that freedom of association could keep the NAACP membership roles out of the hands of the Johns Committee, and the Supreme Court accepted the argument and found actually that his constitutional rights were being violated. And so Gibson emerges victorious. NAACP Inquisition shut down. The Queer Inquisition is still going on, though, and the man who stands up to the Johns Committee there is a Black gay man, a music professor at a junior college called Gibbs in St. Pete, Florida, named William James Neal. William James Neal had been in the midst of the anti-queer persecutions. When they expanded to every state school past the universities, they started going after regular high school teachers, kindergarten art teachers, element and middle school gym teachers, and the Johns Committee started persecuting for the first time very highly ranked Black educators. So William James Neal was called out of his class. He was brought to the office of his white boss and compelled he was compelled to confess something verifiably false under homosexual suspicions. William James Neal was compelled to confess falsely to something that couldn't have happened, that participated in a homosexual liaison in another state, which he couldn't have done because he was actually teaching summer school at that point. Verified, and he did so after 3.5 hours of intense interrogation to get out of the room because they wouldn't let him have a lawyer. And so anyway, William James Neal was, regardless of the fact that the confession was provably false, they fired him, they pulled his teaching credentials, and this was their big mistake, they maligned him in the news. They gave his name, pervert teacher, they gave his name to all the Florida news outlets. And they thought this was the destruction of that man. William James Neal, the black music teacher, the man who looks like he's got a pencil mustache. He looks a little bit like a black Freddie Mercury, like he could dance the mambo. That this man is done. And no, William James Neal decides he's going to sue. He does what no Johns Committee victim had done before. He sued the state of Florida, right, for the violation of its own laws and procedures in his firing. He realized that the Johns Committee had been overzealous and had missed a couple steps in the process of interrogating and firing him. And so he decided he was going to sue in Tallahassee court as a black gay man in segregated Florida. And what he decided to do to beat the segregationists at their own game was to not make race an issue. He was going to make it all about their own procedural screw-ups. And he hired 2 white appellate lawyers. William James Neal then left the state, went to Maryland, and he scrupulously avoided any photographs of himself. And so his case, Neal versus Bryant, proceeded in the early 60s, all the way up to Tallahassee Supreme Court. I could not find in a single legal document any mention of his race at all. So a very conservative Tallahassee Supreme Court found in favor of William James Neal. I'm convinced, not even understanding, they were finding in favor of a black gay man. And William James Neal got his teaching credentials back. He never came back to Florida. He ended up working for the Maryland public school system, where he retired and lived a very peaceful life. And also, the way that the decision was written brought into question anyone else who'd been fired under the same tactics that William James Neal had been fired. So this black gay music professor shut down the anti-queer inquisition that the Johns Committee had found even more successful than their anti-black purges. And so it was him who did it. So it was these 2 cases by 2 very brave black American citizens that brought it down. And then the Johns Committee, they were basically treading water, and they shot themselves in the face. The last thing they did was they decided they didn't have anyone else to interrogate anymore. They're stuck. They've got money to spend. They have not produced a single communist in 8 years. What are they going to do? They're going to put all their anti-gay information they've gathered, all the pornography, all the erotica they've taken out of different places or bought themselves. They're going to put it all in this reefer madness style document that they're going to present to the Florida public of proof that people need to be afraid of homosexuals and that Charlie Johns is going to keep you safe from these immoral hordes. And so here's what they're going to do. They put it all together in this document they called they gave it an innocuous title, Homosexuality and Citizenship in Florida. And they put gay imagery there that they thought was appropriate, but it turns out they'd been a little desensitized to gay imagery. They've been looking at some of it a little bit too long, and they didn't understand taste considerations. They gave this document, again, a boring name, but they gave it a provocative cover, these purple swirls that looked like something out of Hitchcock's Vertigo, and they decided this is going to scare the public, and this is going to keep us in power. Well, Floridians almost immediately nicknamed it the purple pamphlet. This thing was considered way too hot to handle for the time period, for a time period where it was controversial for Lucille Ball to be pregnant on television. Then people got this state document that had the state seal on the back of it. They opened up the purple pamphlet and they saw an image right off the bat of 2 men naked at the waist down, making out with each other, kissing. People threw up. This was the first time in their lives, oftentimes, that any Floridian had seen such an image graphically presented, and it was the state that used taxpayer dollars to do it. And there's several more images. There was a young sort of, they'd call it chicken, now we call it a twink, a young gay man who is like naked, bought wearing a thong tied to what looked to be a garden trellis. There was other imagery that people couldn't believe it. In the back, a glossary of homosexual terms that was a virtual how-to of the lifestyle, stuff I hadn't even heard of. I mean, this would be considered hot by today's standards, and this was something that they produced in 1964. Well, this is their political Waterloo. The governor declares it to be obscene, wants to pull it from public prosecutors, demand that it be pulled from distribution, or they're going to prosecute. They're threatening to prosecute using state obscenity laws, and the Johns Committee is going to be liable to this stuff. So they try to pull it from distribution as fast as possible. But gay erotica presses got a hold of it first, and they published it nationwide for a profit. The purple pamphlet, bragging that the state of Florida had succeeded in printing imagery hotter than they'd ever been able to get away with. And they were able to do it because it was a state document with the state seal on it. There was no copyright. So through the 1970s, it became a hot trend to campily display a copy of the purple pamphlet on a gay coffee table in a gay home. So that was it. That was lights out for the Johns Committee. Basically, after the purple pamphlet came out and it was pulled, their reputation was completely destroyed. They'd lost the big cases. In the end they produced gay pornography. Trying to warn people about homosexuality, they had produced gay pornography for public consumption. And so that brought them down. The Johns Committee loses their appropriation in 65. It ends. No one's even sure who turns the lights off at that point. And then not only that, but it brings down the pork choppers. The pork choppers are basically lose massively. There all of a sudden is basically there's redistribution and redistricting that suddenly happens. They'd resisted for years. It suddenly happens. And suddenly even Charlie Johns can't even keep his own seat. Then the 1885 Constitution of the state of Florida that the pork choppers and the Johns Committee loved so much, that was their cover, fell apart. The courts threw it out, saying that it wouldn't allow redistricting through the political system. And so they had to scrap the founding document of the state of Florida and reboot anew with a brand new Florida, right, in the late 60s, all because of what the Johns Committee had done. So that's basically the end of it, that the Johns Committee brought down not just itself, but the Dixiecrats of North Florida and the old state of Florida itself.
I absolutely love this. I mean, I think it's so important, especially when we're in times like these where it's easy to kind of lose heart and see all of the cruelty and all of the evil. But as you say, two Black men standing up and suing became the unraveling of this to the point that the Johns Committee becomes the largest purveyor of gay porn in the country. That is just a delicious twist at the end. But there's another part of this that I think is important for people to know, because all of this history might have been lost.
Right.
We might never have known these stories, been able to tell these stories. But you mentioned somebody early on who's been a really critical piece of it, Stacey Brockman.
Yeah.
And what she was able to salvage. And I want to give her flowers, because we have been seeking to get the state of Florida to recognize and acknowledge what the Johns Committee, what it inflicted, the harm that it did, to issue an apology to the people whose lives were destroyed, and the hateful culture that spawned from it. Mm-hmm. And so we have brought this resolution year in and year out, and this is somebody that we had turned to find the right way to talk about this and to frame it. And in some ways, well, not in some ways, but very specifically, she was instrumental in, they would have redacted this into oblivion and tried to for years and years. So tell the story of how you were able to gain access to, this treasure trove of documents that they had tried to hide from the public.
Yeah. So, well, the Johns Committee in 65, when they turned the lights out, they lost their appropriation, they had to close down. They perfectly planned their own retreat. It was the greatest trick that Charlie Johns ever pulled, was basically sealing the records for the Johns Committee using arcane rules of a constitution that was about to collapse from 1885. So they decided they sealed it in perpetuity, meaning the public was never going to be able to see it. Even after the new Constitution booted up and Florida came up with this concept of, it's almost laughable now, government and sunshine. I'm so sorry, but like, and sunshine laws and open meetings and government, you know what I mean? This kind of notion. The Johns Committee papers stayed sealed. Charlie Johns holds on to this notion with an iron grip until he dies, right, in late 80s, early 1990s. And then a state constitutional amendment passes that allows for it demands legislative files, even old antique legislative files, become available for public review. Well, then the legislature then freaks out because some of them know what's in the Johns Committee papers in these 22 bankers boxes of stuff, and they know that they are fearful that if full knowledge of all of the misdeeds, all of the atrocities that the Johns Committee performs incompetently, but prolifically, that it would damage not just the reputation of former office holders or the family members of those office holders that were still in state government, but it would damage the standing of the offices themselves. Meaning they feared that they were going to have to reboot the state again, out of in the face of public vitriol over the hiding of all of this information. And so the legislature decides, they debate about it, and they decide they're going to pass legislation that specifically says we're going to redact the name of every victim of the Florida Johns Committee to protect their privacy. No sense hurting them twice, right? The state hurt them back then. No need to hurt them now. We're just looking out for them now and their reputation.
Ooh, Epstein files. I can hear it. Go ahead.
And so, a Tallahassee paralegal who'd written she was a master's degree student at University of South Florida named Bonnie Stark. She was and she'd written the first thesis on the Johns Committee called McCarthyism in Florida. She was present during the document release debates in 1993 over the Johns Committee papers and the redactions. Bonnie Stark was one of the lone people who testified in favor of open records. Her testimony, her one-person campaign failed, but because the redactions happened, for all of the private individuals who were hurt, their names were erased. The records of basically what the state perpetrated to them was gone. But Bonnie won sympathizers in 1973 in the state Senate staff, who then secretly funneled to her a second set of very loosely redacted of the Johns Committee records that she then personally acquired. She pulled up her Hyundai Elantra in the 1990s to the backloading dock of the Senate building. They helped load the boxes in. She pulled away, and then she held on to those boxes for 30 years. 30 years working as a paralegal in Tallahassee, not 5-6 blocks away from some of these seats of power, the Senate building, the state archive, etc. And no one really knew that existed. Okay, and then in the and so fast forward a little bit, Stacey Brockman, using the papers that were redacted, but still existed at the state archive, the first set, the official set, Stacey Brockman was able to create Communists and Perverts Under the Palms in the 2010s, the definitive academic text on the Johns Committee. An awesome book, incredible, a masterwork of scholarship. And then because she's the primary scholar on this subject, state legislators in 2018, when they start looking at this is an era when they start thinking about symbolic restitution and start thinking about we need to get language written firmly placed where the state government and the state legislature acknowledges its misdeeds, the atrocities of the Johns Committee, names the victims, says this will never happen again. So they contact Stacey Brockman to write the resolution, and Stacey Brockman nails it. It is a masterwork of concision. But she gets it all in. It's an incredible document, and she becomes part of the first initiatives to pass a recognition and apology resolution for the Johns Committee. And then and that's ongoing while I'm writing my darn book, American Scare. And then I in the midst of researching and not being able to make heads or tails beyond what Stacey did at the State Archive, I meet Bonnie Stark, who has the second set in the midst of writing my book. And Bonnie Stark says, I've got the hard copies of these documents. I've been lugging these around for years and I want to give them to you. And so I got the Bonnie Stark set, the secret second set, and I was able to use and collate them with the first set and with Stacy's research to unearth the name and reintroduce back into the historic record the name of 75% of the victims of the individuals hurt by the Florida Johns Committee. And so while we're moving forward the scholarship on the Johns Committee and consistently digging away and chipping away at making sure all the full knowledge of what the Johns Committee perpetrated is known, y'all are involved, and the state legislature is involved every year in an apology resolution, a proposal for an apology and recognition resolution that has gone on now for 6 years. And why don't you talk about your experience, maybe of going through that journey?
Well, I mean, obviously, the Florida legislature has always been a hostile place for our community, and it's not something that they have embraced. And so we introduced it not with the expectation it would immediately pass, but with the knowledge that by introducing it, we would get to talk about this, that we would get to educate the public, and that eventually we would chip away and get to the place where recognition, apology, and the commitment never to return to those days could be made public. And that bill is coming back. That bill will be introduced once again this legislative session. I want to shout out to Senator Carlos Guillermo Smith, who will be the Senate sponsor, and House my representative, who will be Michelle Rayner, who will be the sponsor in the House. And we are going to continue to push this. Yeah, people have to hear this story. They have to understand why it's not simply, again, that they're removing rainbow crosswalks. They're going into schools and they are taking books that have, no matter how innocent the representation, that we exist. One of the first books they took was And Tango Makes Three, the true story of two male penguins raising an orphaned penguin chick. Anything that shows our humanity, they want to erase, and they are using the same language that you are writing about in American Scare, a book that is really so, it tells the story in such a powerful way. It connects the racism with the attack on the LGBTQ community, and it does it at a moment when they are trying their best to erase this history, to whitewash it, and to pretend that it didn't happen. And so I'm so grateful to you, because not only have you written this book, you have made yourself so available and to tell this story here in Florida, and it is really phenomenal.
It's important. It's like these campaigns are almost always in service of a power grab. They and especially these they're anti-democratic, and unfortunately these arch conservative campaigns that use McCarthyist tactics, they so easily divide and conquer. They separate us into our little isolated issues, and and therefore, as we're struggling in our own individual fights, we are not seeing the broader picture, which is basically the reality of how Florida's become an incubator in our culture wars. That a lot of the notions, basically DC's, that there's the two most important political centers of the United States right now are Washington, D.C., where it's a bunch of Floridians running the show, basically. Pam Bondi's Attorney General, Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, et cetera. And then Tallahassee, Florida, where a lot of the notions of Project 2025 are experimented with and incubated for the first time and perfected. And D.C. now is a reflection, in a way people don't understand, of Tallahassee politics. To the extent that now I hear a lot of people saying, is this the United States of Florida? And basically it behooves not just Floridians, but the rest of our country to understand that what happens in Florida truly, truly matters for the rest of us. And y'all are not just like the third largest state by population, the largest, fastest growing state still, right? And you're only going to get more and more important. Between 900 and 1,000 people move to your beautiful state every day, and I understand why. It offers potentially a very high quality of life. It is a beautiful place to live. It is a fun place to live. There's there's all the reasons why it's considered, but there is this toxic political legacy that seems to weigh down all of that that cultural overage that everyone talks about, and that comes from the unfinished business, really, of the middle of the last century. Y'all have not had a truth and reconciliation moment, which is what you're trying to push forward, Nadine, with this resolution campaign, to acknowledge this is where we were, this is what these same institutions did. This is where we are now. We are not those institutions anymore. We're not going back to that. And those tactics are not just brutal, but they're contrary to the spirit and to the letter of our republic, right? Scapegoating individual citizens by breaking us up into these tiny little marginal groups, disappearing our history so you can say we're just new things and we weren't always here the whole time, then disappearing us now. Those are brutal I hate to say it, but anti-American tactics, and contrary to the great diversity of our country, and contrary to the fact that we are a rainbow society, and that's the strength of Florida, and that's the strength of the rest of the country, is that we all come from somewhere else.
Yeah. Well, I think that the message that is delivered in your book and delivered here in this conversation is really clear to me. We have to stand up as an LGBTQ community. We have to push back against the racism, against the direct attacks on our community, against the erosion of democracy, and we have to do it here on this front line. And the things that we are learning here become the blueprint that other states are using. And I tell people who go, oh gosh, it must be tough in Florida. It is, but we're figuring out their weaknesses. Just in the same way that those who fought back against, in the courts against the Johns Committee, the closer you get, the more you see their weaknesses. And the imagery that we try to instill in people is to think of sand in the gears. Sometimes that sand can feel like it's just bouncing off, but then you realize it's slowing down the machine. And in Tallahassee, sometimes slowing down the machine is the same as stopping it. But then one day, there will be that grain of sand that causes that gear to break, that causes that machine to fall apart. And with the Johns Committee, it was a black gay music teacher at Gibbs.
Yes,
And it was the head of the NAACP and their attorney having the foresight to move their documents out of the state of Florida and stymie this. And I think the biggest message I want to deliver to people is we've all got to throw that sand at the machine, and you never know. It may be the very first fistful of sand that you pick up and throw, uncertain whether it matters, that is the one that breaks the machine completely. So we are here. We are unafraid, and we are pushing back, and we are bedeviling them at every turn. And so it has been wonderful getting to know you, getting to read American Scare, and I thank you so much. And for everybody who wants to join this effort, legislative session has started, committee weeks have begun, bills are being submitted. We will be bringing people to Tallahassee again to raise your voices. There is something for you to do no matter where you live across the state. And even if you don't live in Florida, there are things that you can do, because what happens in Florida does not stay in Florida. Anita Bryant didn't stay in Florida. She took her hateful campaign, which was driven by the same factors. People who wanted, the moral majority wanted to end school integration, and they saw attacking gay people as the political cover to do whatever they wanted. And so here we stand again, and we have to be ready to fight back. And you have given us in American Scare a real blueprint, and I appreciate you, and we're going to have you back again. And when it comes time to testify in Tallahassee, we're going to need you there.
I will do it. I will answer the call gladly for as long as you need it. This is so important and such an honorable fight. And I will gladly join. Just name the day, name the time.
How can people keep in touch with you? Robert?
I'm best reached on Instagram because I think that's the nice, enjoyable medium. But I'm at Word Bobby, at WORDBOBBY. No one can spell my last name, so I just do Word Bobby. And it's fine. My childhood best friend can't spell it. It's not personal. And so and that's the best way to reach me. Because otherwise you're going to try my German last name and you may get my website or you may not. But Instagram's the best way. And how's the best way for people to get involved in this campaign, Nadine?
Yeah, you can visit equalityflorida.org. You can email Nadine at equalityflorida.org, and I'll connect you with the organizer in your community, in your area. But this is all hands on deck. We need each other, and the rest of the country is watching us and counting on us to fight back with everything we've got.
We need to bring down the John Zian legacy, expose it and bring it down. And it's ordinary citizens that will do it. Campaigns like this work. It's ordinary people that step forward to do it, to speak up. And eventually that you will be brave and mighty forces will come to your aid. You will be amazed the power you will attract to yourself with your courage.
We'll let that be the last word. Thanks everybody for joining. Robert, thank you so much. Hope to talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks, Nadine.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.